Hello, Courtmore. I thought I'd read you something a little bit different this week. Most of you know that I'm a massive Harry Potter fan and therefore a massive J.K. Rowling fan. And during lockdown, she's been releasing chapters of a story she wrote for her children called the Ickabog. It's coming up chapter by chapter, week by week, and you can just Google the Ickabog and it'll come up. So that's Ickabog. So I thought I'd read you some of chapter 1. Chapter 1, King Fred the Fearless. Once upon a time there was a tiny country called Cornucopia, which had been ruled for centuries by a long line of fair-haired kings. The king at the time of which I write was called King Fred the Fearless. He denounced the fearless bit himself on the morning of his coronation, partly because it sounded nice with Fred, but also because he'd once managed to catch and kill a wasp all by himself, if you didn't count 5 footmen and the boot boy. King Fred the Fearless came to the throne on a huge wave of popularity. He had lovely yellow curls, fine sweeping moustaches, and looked magnificent in the tight breeches, velvet doublets and ruffled shirts that rich men wore at the time. Fred was said to be generous, smiled and waved whenever anyone caught sight of him, and looked awfully handsome in the portraits that were distributed throughout the kingdom to be hung in town halls. The people of Cornucopia were most happy with their new king, and many thought he'd end up being even better at the job than his father, Richard the Righteous, whose teeth, though nobody had liked to mention it at the time, were rather crooked. King Fred was secretly relieved to find out how easy it was to rule Cornucopia. In fact, the country seemed to run itself. Nearly everybody had lots of food, the merchants made pots of gold, and Fred's advisers took care of any little problem that arose. All that was left for Fred to do was beam at his subjects whenever he went out in his carriage and go hunting 5 times a week with his 2 best friends, Lord Spittleworth and Lord Flapoon. Spittleworth and Flapoon had large estates of their own in the country, but they found it much cheaper and more amusing to live at the palace with the king, eating his food, hunting his stags, and making sure that the king didn't get too fond of any of the beautiful ladies at court. They had no wish to see Fred married, because a queen might spoil all their fun. For a time, Fred had seemed to rather like Lady Eslander, who was as dark and beautiful as Fred was fair and handsome, but Spittleworth had persuaded Fred that she was far too serious and bookish for the country to love her as a queen. Fred didn't know that Lord Spittleworth had a grudge against Lady Eslander. He'd once asked her to marry him, but she'd turned him down. Lord Spittleworth was very thin, cunning and clever. His friend Flapoon was ruddy-faced and so enormous that it required 6 men to heave him onto his massive chestnut horse. Though not as clever as Spittleworth, Flapoon was still far sharper than the king. Both lords were expert at flattery and pretending to be astonished by how good Fred was at everything from riding to tiddlywinks. If Spittleworth had a particular talent, it was persuading the king to do things that suited Spittleworth, and if Flapoon had a gift, it was for convincing the king that nobody on earth was as loyal to the king as his 2 best friends. Fred thought Spittleworth and Flapoon were jolly good chaps. They urged him to hold fancy parties, elaborate picnics and sumptuous banquets, because Cornucopia was famous far beyond its borders for its food. Each of its cities was known for a different kind, and each was the very best in the world. The capital of Cornucopia, Shoeville, lay in the south of the country and was surrounded by acres of orchards, fields of shimmering golden wheat and emerald green grass on which pure white dairy cows grazed. The cream, flour and fruit produced by the farmers here was then given to the exceptional bakers of Shoeville, who made pastries. Think, if you please, of the most delicious cake or biscuit you have ever tasted. Well, let me tell you that they'd have been downright ashamed to serve that in Shoeville. Unless a grown man's eyes filled with tears of pleasure as he bit into a Shoeville pastry, it was deemed a failure and never made again. The bakery windows of Shoeville were piled high with delicacies such as maiden dreams, fairies' cradles, and, most famous of all, hopes of heaven, which were so exquisitely, painfully delicious that they were saved for special occasions, and everybody cried for joy as they ate them. King Porphyrio of neighbouring Pluritania had already sent King Fred a letter offering him the choice of any of his daughter's hands in marriage in exchange for a lifetime supply of hopes of heaven. But Spittleworth had advised Fred to laugh in the Pluritanian ambassador's face. I hope you enjoyed that. Do have a look, read through and have a look at the other chapters on there. Like I said, they're coming out week by week. She's looking for people to illustrate the book for her as a competition. So if you're interested in drawing or art, then get drawing, get creative. And we'd love to see if any of you do enter the competition. Thanks, Courtmore.